have three presentations. So the first one is history of the interdisciplinary approach by state of the Utah and stakeholder groups to develop strategy and policy to safeguard Great Salt Lakes and its virtual resources for wildlife and industry. So Thomas and Bosteels and Tim Hawks will present this session. Please.
Okay, thank you. We changed the title just a little bit. We called it "It Takes a Village," working with stakeholders to create technical and policy solutions to protect Great Salt Lake. Why it takes a village? Because we have this saying in English that says, it takes a village to bring up a child, meaning it's a group effort. It takes more than just one person. And that's really what we feel about Great Salt Lake. What we feel is that it's really been a group effort over the last 3 decades or so to create this sustainable management of Great Salt Lake. So before we start, Tim and I will tag team, so we'll take turns on parts of the presentation. We would encourage everybody to ask questions. If you have a question, put up your hand. Let's get the question asked. If we feel we're running out of time, then we'll ask you to move on and we'll answer either the questions at the end or we'll do it during our coffee breaks and our lunch breaks. So, what are we going to talk about today? We'll talk about some key historic events. And those are some key historic events that really laid the groundwork for the future actions on Great Salt Lake. We'll talk more specifically about the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program and about the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. After that, we'll hit on what we call a two-pronged approach to solving the issues with regard to Great Salt Lake. And they are, on the one hand, creating technical solutions to solve issues, and on the other hand, taking legal and policy actions, trying to find legal and policy solutions. So we'll end up with showing how complex all these interactions really are, and then finally we'll leave some time for some key takeaways and maybe some additional questions if they're there. So, key historic events. In 1951, we started harvesting Artemia on Great Salt Lake. This was one company, the Sanders Brine Shrimp Company, and they harvest only biomass. It was only in the 60s that they started to harvest Artemia cysts, so quite a bit later that they started to harvest cysts when that demand started to come up. In 1959, the Union Pacific Railway built a causeway, a dam across the Great Salt Lake. And that was nothing that we controlled. It was nothing that we managed initially, but it was something that happened. They decided to do that because they had wooden stanchions and it wasn't safe anymore, and they decided to build a dike. But you will see later that that became a very important feature of Great Salt Lake and how we manage it. And then in 1993, the Utah Artemia Association was established. And why is that important? It's important because it was the first time that all the different companies came together, actually came together and decided to talk as one group rather than fight each other on all the little issues, trying to come together on the big issues. And it's not by coincidence that about a year later, the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program was established. And the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program is run by the Utah government, but it was established with the help of the brine shrimp industry. And we'll talk about it later. Fast forward a couple of decades, and in 2010, the Utah legislature formed the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. So it established that council by law, and the whole role of that council is to advise the government on matters Great Salt Lake. And we will see in the coming slides that those two events were really crucial in determining the future management of the Great Salt Lake. One, because it laid the groundwork for the technical solutions, and the other one, because it commissioned the studies that helped inform future policy responses. And then what we saw in 2023 is that Great Salt Lake obtained the MSC certification, Marine Stewardship Council certification, the first one in the US for an inland fishery, the first one in the world for an Artemia fishery. And it was also in that year that, again, the Utah government created the position of the Great Salt Lake Commissioner, and that is a very important position because the Commissioner controls and coordinates all matters Great Salt Lake over all the different government agencies. So there you go. That is a little bit of a historic perspective. What we want to do first is focus on that Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program and on the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, and then later we'll talk about these specific responses and technical solutions. So, going into the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program, what really laid the groundwork for the implementation of our technical solutions. Why? Why did that happen? That would be the first question. Well, here's why it happened. In the 1990s, several companies working on Great Salt Lake were concerned about overfishing. Why? Because some of the natural fish stocks in the US, especially on the East Coast, were being completely depleted. One example is the cod. And so they had these concerns, and what the industry did, how did they go about those concerns is, well, the industry approached the then director of the Division of Wildlife Resources, Bob Valentine was his name, and they went to the director. Again, remember, a year prior to that, we created an industry group that spoke as one voice, the Utah Artemia Association. As a group, we went to the director of the Division of Wildlife Resources, and we told the director, you need to control us, because we are worried about the resource. And the director said, well, okay, we'd love to do that, but we don't have funds to do that. And our industry said, okay, just increase the cost of our permits so that you can fund this research program. You can fund this management program. And that's what they did. And the Division of Wildlife Resources then created the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program. They also created at the same time a technical advisory group. And the technical advisory group is made up of experts from the industry, as well as from academia, as well as from state agencies, that then advises on what research to continue with, what research to do, and how exactly to bring that research about. So why was that event, creating that Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program, so important for future technical solutions? On the one hand, it laid, by studying the Artemia population long term, it really supported creating that adaptive, sustainable harvest model that we'll talk about in a little bit. By implementing long-term research or long-term studies on the nutrients flowing into the lake, the nutrient cycling, the phytoplankton in the lake, it really informed on future nutrient management decisions that needed to be taken. By looking at the abiotic factors, especially salinity, laid the groundwork for future salinity management decisions. And then by doing a lot of microcosm studies in the lab, we were actually able to simulate what might happen under conditions that we hadn't experienced on the Great Salt Lake, and anticipate, model if you want, what may happen, for example, when the salinity became too high. And then finally, the long-term studies of the avian population was also very important, because there's a big avian population on Great Salt Lake that relies on the Artemia population for its nourishment. So, with that, we'll start talking about the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, and I think Tim will do that.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Good afternoon, everybody. So, Thomas is really talking a little bit about the technical side and the groundwork for that, and so I'll talk about the groundwork for policy changes, and that really goes back a little more than 10 years ago, almost 15 years ago, to the founding of the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. That's a group that the industry played a key role in pulling together, and there's been a tradition since it was founded that the Artemia representative has been the chair of that group. So before me it was a guy by the name of Don Leonard, and now I currently chair the council. If you roll the slide there, Thomas, thank you. So go ahead and just animate it. So the council basically tries to pull together people that care about Great Salt Lake. I will say that until recently, most people in Utah don't care about Great Salt Lake. So these were the people that did. The brine shrimp industry, mineral companies, NGOs, environmental groups principally, and then some local governments. And that's who founded this group. Next bit. And the goal, originally they wanted a commission, a formal kind of government entity to have power related to the lake. The Utah legislature says we don't like those. And so instead they decided to do a commission with no authority, no legal authority. But it did have the advantage of having credibility with stakeholders because the group is so diverse. So go ahead and hit the next one, Thomas. So what that group has done with kind of a shoestring budget, really no budget and no authority, is tell the story of the lake in a way that resonates with a broader audience. So a lot of people will say, for example, well, what is the Great Salt Lake? Well, what does it mean if the lake isn't healthy? And so they came up in 2012, they came up with a metric that sort of said, hey, if the lake is healthy, then you'll see a lot of green boxes. If the lake is unhealthy, you'll see a lot of red boxes. Well, this study has stood the test of time. Even today, people cite this study routinely to say, hey, at these low lake levels, we see a lot of reds, a lot of bad outcomes happening, not just for the brine shrimp industry, but for the birds or for other issues, more dust coming off the lake, for example. And so this lake health study, very significant. They also tried to quantify what is the economic value of the water left in the lake. Again, with the idea to be able to argue to policymakers and the public that the lake matters because it provides real economic value. And the initial study was cited for years and years and years. Then later, studies about, well, what happens if the lake goes away? What would that mean for the state of Utah? What would the costs be? And then a lot of other studies. But these studies answer critical questions, provide critical narratives and stories to help get people, political leaders, business leaders, concerned about and engaged in the lake.
Okay, so I'll take over from here. So we talked a little bit about GSLEP and GSLAC as we refer to it, and now what we want to do is talk about these technical responses, technical solutions, and policy responses. And really what we have on the Great Salt Lake, it's a two-pronged approach. In terms of the technical solutions, we're looking at sustainable harvest management, we're looking at nutrient inflow management that feed the algae, that feed the Artemia, and we're looking at salinity management. So those are the three main items when it comes to the technical solutions. On the other hand, when it comes to policy and legislative actions, we're really looking at structurally changing the legal framework with regard to water in Utah. And we're a desert in Utah. Everybody wants that water. We're looking at water conservation measures, and then we're looking at funding that water that we need for the Great Salt Lake. So what we'll do first is we'll focus on those technical solutions. And the first one I want to talk about is adaptive, sustainable harvest management. So what is it? Well, the harvest management was started in 1996, the state of Utah. That's when it actively started. But the management that we refer to today was actually started in 1997. And it's based on a stock recruitment curve, kind of like a Ricker curve, but an adapted Ricker curve, where you have an upward arm that's density dependent, and you have a downward arm that is resource dependent or nutrition dependent. So it depends on the algae population primarily. So what you see in the x-axis is you see what standing stock is left in the lake after the harvest that will repopulate the lake in the spring after the winter. And what you see in the y-axis is how many cysts that will produce during the next fall period. And the optimal escapement stock that was first determined was 21 cysts per liter, and it hasn't changed much since then. Its adaptive is in as these points that the reality that we plot out changes, it may change that graph back and forth a little bit, but it hasn't changed much since the initiation thereof. We could talk for a whole day about this management system, but it's been described in several publications. It's available. If you're interested, I can point you in the right direction on that. But really what we want to do is we want to talk about the result of that. And the graph that you see in front of you is the harvest over the years starting in the 1995-96 season when we started that harvest management. And what you see in these orange bars are the size of the harvest. And remember, this is in dry weight. This is not raw weight, this is dry weight. And what you see there is at the beginning when we started that harvest management, you see a lot of variability. And that variability over time becomes more stable. And if you look at the red line shows you the trailing standard, the trailing 5-year standard deviation. You see how that was really, really high at the beginning, at the onset of that management system. But as we became better at figuring out when to stop exactly, stop at that 21 cysts per liter, it really stabilized the harvest. And yes, there are still some outliers from time to time. There are some outliers when the weather is really, really warm for a long time, we can get a large harvest. There's some outliers when the salinity became too high, we get little smaller harvest. But the bottom line is that we get a more stable harvest over time with this system. And you can see that the regression, that blue line, is actually an upward regression. I have to mention here it's not significant at this point, but nevertheless it shows you that at least it's stable. If anything, the trend is slightly upwards. Okay, so enough about the management system. Happy to talk about it more. There's a lot written about it. You can find it online, or I can help you in the right direction. But the next step that we wanted to talk about is the nutrient management. And first, I just kind of wanted to explain what we learned, because we started this research 3 decades ago. And what we learned is that the Great Salt Lake is primarily nitrogen limited. There's a little bit of co-limitation occasionally between nitrogen and phosphorus, but most of the time phosphorus is there in plenty amounts. And it's the nitrogen that matters the most. What we also learned is that there's a lot of cycling happening in the Great Salt Lake, as is typical for most endorheic systems. And maybe what is important is that a very high quantity of that nitrogen is actually right there in the system, and a lot of it is in the benthos. A lot of it is at the bottom of the lake, if you want, in the sandy bottom and in the microbialites. And so we know that there's a big pool there. But we also know that when you look at dissolved nitrogen, about on average 8% of that dissolved nitrogen has to be replenished on a yearly basis. And how does that happen? It happens primarily through natural inflows into the lake. And you could say, well, you don't really control that. You're right, we don't control that. So 90% of the inflow of nitrogen we don't control. Although we can support it, and we'll talk about that. The other 10% is coming from direct man-made activity. It's coming from inflows from water treatment. And that's where there's really a connection in the West, in the desert, between nutrient management and water management. And I'll try and explain that. If you think about it, if you have an urban system, again, if anybody has questions, just put up your hand and we'll stop for a little bit here, take the question. Okay, so I'll continue for now. If you have an urban system, that urban system produces a lot of wastewater. In the US, that wastewater gets treated. Most of that wastewater gets treated to a certain level, and then that treated wastewater in the Great Salt Lake Basin gets released back into the Great Salt Lake. And as it gets released into the Great Salt Lake, we get both water and we get nutrients. So we get both, right? Now, when these regulations become more strict, and they often become more strict, where people are looking at nutrients in freshwater systems and are worried about eutrophication. And we all know that eutrophication can be an issue. So when these regulations get stricter, what happens is you still get the water, but you don't get the same amount of nitrogen anymore, because that nitrogen gets treated out of the system. And what happened in Utah, and this was really crucial, is in order to build a more efficient water treatment system, it can cost a water treatment plant up to $100 million to do that effectively. What does a water treatment plant do as a result of that? They'll say, well, $100 million to build this system. If I add $20 or $30 million, I can build an even more efficient system. And then I can reuse that water. And guess what happens then? We lose it for the Great Salt Lake. At that point, we lose both the nitrogen and the water. So you can see how nitrogen management and water are really intertwined when it comes to a deserty region that we live in. So what did we try to do about that? In Utah, it's the Division of Water Quality that regulates that water. And that division came up with some really interesting solutions and worked together with our industry and other industries on these solutions. One was to create nutrient criteria that are based on a combination of numeric factors and ecological responses. So if you create a nutrient criteria that's purely based on a numeric criteria, what government officials tend to do is they tend to make that criteria rather strict in order to avoid the false negatives. And if you make those criteria very strict, we're losing the nitrogen. On the other hand, if you make that criteria too broad, then you have a risk that indeed you get eutrophication. So what we did with the Division of Water Quality is we created two numeric criteria that were two extremes. One, that if the nitrogen is below that level, we know it's safe. The other is if the nitrogen is above a high level, we know it's an issue. But if the nitrogen is in between, we're looking at the ecological responses. And very often these ecological responses are totally acceptable. And then further water treatment isn't needed. So that's one example of sort of a creative way to approach these problems in the freshwater streams in the state of Utah. And that was developed, really unique as a first time that this combination of criteria was developed in the US for water treatment.
Because Thomas,
yes?
EPA is very strict in these regulations. So Utah is really an exception?
No, Utah is not an exception. So the EPA is very strict, but the EPA basically says, look, if as a state you want to regulate it, you can, but we're going to control that regulation. So if you don't do it, we're going to come in and take over. So
these are examples of circular economy.
Yes.
Real examples.
Yeah.
In Europe, we are talking about the future circular economy. This is an example.
Yeah. This is indeed, really an example. And what is really interesting is that the state of Utah does a very good job of bringing together all the stakeholders. So rather than taking sort of these decisions, ex cathedra from the top, They're really trying to understand what all of the issues are and then try to come up with a solution that's acceptable to everybody, but still also acceptable to the EPA. Another really interesting one was one of the water treatment plants was bringing its effluent directly into a brackish area of the Great Salt Lake. And in that brackish area, we had problems with eutrophication, but more importantly, with these toxic algal blooms. And these toxic algal blooms, when you have them, the EPA will come in and make you do something about it. And so having been able to show through the years of research that these algal blooms actually don't produce cyanotoxins, these bacteria or blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, don't produce the toxins at the high salinity. So the Division of Water Quality agreed that rather than put in a very expensive water treatment system, that water treatment plant could divert through a 6-mile pipeline its effluents directly into the hypersaline part of Great Salt Lake without creating any problems. And so those are some examples of what's happening with nutrient management around Great Salt Lake. Okay, so that brings us to the last management topic, active management topic, and that is the management of salinity. We know that there's a safe salinity on the Great Salt Lake. We know that if we go below that salinity, we get issues with predation, primarily with chorixids. And we knew in the past, from the microcosm studies that we did, that above 16, 17%, we started to see population level declines. And so that's what we saw with the species Artemia franciscana on Great Salt Lake. And so our whole goal became trying to manage this salinity between that 8 and 16%. Those were the goals that were set. And if you look at what happened over the last 2 decades, you could see that the level of the lake has been declining because of the 2 decades of drought that we've seen. And as a result of that, the salinity has been going up. And guess what? It went up to 18%, so above that magic 16% that we consider truly safe.
When you say truly safe, you focus on the salinity, but am I right or not? It is also linked to nutrients. Because I have seen places where at 180, even at 200, Artemia is doing very well, but this is where you have high blooms of the Mariella. So could it be that at the Great Salt Lake, your 160 is also linked with nutrient level? Not really.
And the reason I'm saying not really is that at these levels of salinity, we actually get primarily Dunaliella. We get primarily Dunaliella. But what we saw is a reduction in production overall. And if you look, and you can see that if you look at the literature, you get a reduction in primary production at these levels, in secondary production at these levels.
It could also be related, and that's something for tomorrow, to the species.
It could be. It could be species dependent, because what I'm hearing from, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, the concentration of cyst harvest is in a particular area, or you can have it distributed in several places in the lake?
It's distributed in several places in the lake, but it's primarily the case because of the currents that are in the lake. Because we have that north and south side, we have fresh water coming in, it moves the water in a certain way, and that accumulates the cysts in different areas at different parts of the year.
Yeah, because the question is related with what Patrick said. I'm really concerned about the number of populations, different populations that you can have in the lake. Maybe.
And I certainly couldn't answer that question because we didn't do that research specifically, but what I can tell you is that we see a lot of mixing over the whole lake, both vertical and horizontal mixing. Both vertical and horizontal. Yeah. Now, yeah. We did have a subpopulation in the north arm when the salinity was lower, but that's very extreme. But that's not the case today. So what's the solution to the problem? And the solution is a combination of active salinity management and bringing more water back into the lake. again, these two different things have to happen. So what we'll do here first is focus on active salinity management. So you'll remember in 1959, Union Pacific built that dam all the way across the lake. There was some communication between the north and the south through culverts. These started to fail, and as a result of, I should say that first, as a result of all the fresh water coming into the south of the lake, we create a salinity difference between the south and the north. The north being hypersaline at saturation, the south being hypersaline in that range of typically 8 to 18% is what we've seen in the last 2 decades now. In 2017, because the connections between the north and the south were failing, Union Pacific was forced to build a new breach with a bridge into that dike and a bridge across that dike. And when Union Pacific decided to do that, the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, which Tim just talked about, convinced the Utah government to build an adaptive management berm in that breach. And this is what it looks like. If you would take a section of that breach, a cross-section of that breach, and you would take a look at that cross-section, what you see is on the right-hand side, you see Gilbert Bay, which is the fresher area of the lake. That's where all the fresh water is coming in. That fresh water is pushing the medium salinity brine north through that bridge. What happens is that in the north, you have saturated brine. Saturated brine is denser. So at depth, that denser water creates higher pressure, and it pushes that heavy brine back towards the south. So you can see there's a dynamic between water going to the north and water coming back in from the north to the south. One is fresher, the other one is less fresh or saturated. Now, by building an adaptive management berm, if the north becomes too salty, what do? We block off that return flow. And what we do at that point is we continue to push saline water north, so we're exporting salt. If it becomes too fresh, we allow that return flow to come back. If we cannot very quickly bring enough water back into the lake and we continue to be into a drought, then we just shut the whole thing off, which is sort of the extreme solution. We keep all that water in the south, and at least our initial calculations tell us that we should be able to, even under that extreme drought, maintain that water level. So that's how we actively manage that salt.
Is that already in place?
That's in place. That's in place. And interestingly, so the principles are simple, right? I just explained the principles. And it's because we have information on salt mass, on all these salinity calculations that we made, that we could calculate what the salt mass was. And we could come up with these principles. In reality, it's quite a bit more complex. We're using computational fluid mechanic modeling. These guys are using supercomputers to try and model the exact geometry of that breach in order to tell us where we need to be based on where we want to be in terms of export and or import of salt. So, as a result of these calculations, and as a result of the implementation of that breach, we changed that berm structure in 2022 and 2023. And so if you look at what happened, today, where are we at? We got a lot of inflow in the last 2 years because we had exceptional winters, exceptional precipitation, and that, of course, created a dilution of the south arm and a lower salinity in the south arm. But looking at the salt mass that we can compute, what we saw is that a portion of that decrease in salinity was purely related to exporting the salt, which is our active management. And again, I can talk to you about this for a long time, but I think we need to move forward. But what we did figure out is that about 4 ppt per year for that volume of the lake, we can either reduce or we can increase based on that active management. So had we not had that influx of fresh water, we wouldn't be sitting at 18%, we would be sitting at 16.5%. Not quite 16 where we want to be, but we sure would be quite close. So did we succeed? Sustainable harvest management, yes. 3 decades of research, we definitely believe that we've made that happen. Nutrient inflow, it's a constant work in progress, but definitely we're making a lot of progress there. Salinity management, we've a proven concept, we've implemented that concept, it's working, but a reminder, it's a little bit of a slow concept. And with that, as we said, it's a combination of both these technical solutions and policy efforts, and Tim will now go back and talk more about these policy responses. And I'll start with the first slide.
Thanks, Thomas. And honestly, the example of the adaptive management breach is almost a perfect segue between a technical solution on the one hand and a policy solution on the other. I say that because it requires the state to act. And so, in other words, somebody has to make a decision to use the tool that's been built. And it was interesting just to think about this, but the reality is we, the industry, are the ones that went to the state and said the time to use that tool is now. If you don't act now, really bad things will happen. And fortunately, we had the good relationships and the credibility that the state acted not once, but twice aggressively to manage the berm to protect the salinity of Gilbert Bay. So it's a good illustration of these two things working hand in hand, the technical and the policy. So just a few background things on policy. Obviously, water is scarce in Utah, as it is in most terminal lake systems, very dry area. There's a challenge of figuring out how to get people to care about Artemia. Most people don't care about Artemia, right? Too obscure for them. How do you get them to take action then? And then obviously a lot of these tools require investment. So how do you secure short-term, medium, long-term investments in the resource? So these are the things that I think about. As a former legislator and policymaker, this is the space that I work in. Just for context, to just explain just how dry Utah is, it gets about 280 millimeters of precipitation annually. Compare that to Vietnam. So I did this for a presentation in Vietnam, but I wanted to say, hey, you know, Vietnam gets 10 times, right, as much rain as Utah. It's a dramatic difference, and you can see it in the landscape. And so you have this fundamental challenge in Utah where it's almost like you have one little bottle of water and all of us sitting around the table, and we all want the water. So how do we share this one little bottle of water in a way that protects Artemia, which nobody cares about, right? So a couple more things. These are just emphasize the challenge. In Utah water law, the Western United States, not just Utah, came up with systems for deciding who gets that bottle of water. And basically what they said is the first person to drink from the bottle of water gets the water, right? So the problem is that bottle, you know, everybody's claiming, well, I get a drink and I get a drink and I get a drink, then there's nothing left. So it's a really big challenge when we say, hey, that water, you've all spoken for the water, we need some of that water back. But this is one of the challenges we face. The second part is this idea of use it or lose it. So if I have a right to drink from the bottle, if I don't actually drink from the bottle, it goes back in the bottle and somebody else can use it, right? The problem is that if I'm a farmer, I want to use all of my water every year. I don't want a drop of it to go into Great Salt Lake. As a matter of fact, in the eyes of the law, every drop of water that gets into Great Salt Lake is considered waste water available for appropriation, available for somebody to come and use it for something else. And so, go back just one really quick. Yeah. So I want to show you again that in the eyes of water law, that picture right here is a perfectly efficient system because all of the water has been used, none of the water has been wasted. So how do we change that dynamic is the challenge. Go ahead, Thomas. So I do think it's interesting that historically, when I was growing up in Utah, most people, the lake is something that you fly over in an airplane. No, people don't really go visit the lake. But it has not been that way historically. There used to be a train that ran from downtown Salt Lake City twice a day to this massive kind of place where people would swim and dance and have fun. People were connected to the lake in ways that they aren't. Next, Thomas. All right, well, let's talk about how we get people to care. I don't get people to care by talking about Artemia. And my environmentalist friends always talk to audiences about birds because they care about birds. The problem is the audience, they don't care about birds, right? So how do we find things that the audience cares about? Thomas, you hit it. So I want to find the things that people care about the most. What's the most important thing to human beings? It's the air we breathe. We care about it for ourselves. We care about it for our families. And if I want to motivate people to care about the lake, I have to tell them that if the lake goes away, their air quality will go down and their health will go down. And if we talk about the Arau, right, or Artemia, we see those same problems, right? But I don't talk about Artemia, I talk about air. The water we drink. The lake is tied to the water cycle. So I tell the skiers, hey, if the lake goes away, ski season is shorter or less water to drink. Farmers, they listen to that too. When I talk about Artemia, I talk about it in the context of food. When they eat a shrimp, a farmed shrimp, there's a good chance that it ate brine shrimp from the Great Salt Lake. They don't know that Artemia from the lake provides 5 million metric tons of seafood globally. It helps feed the hungry world. They don't know that the almonds that they snack on are fertilized with a fertilizer, a sulfate of potash that's pulled from the lake. They don't know that when they touch a soda can or a beer can that it contains magnesium from the lake. So we talk about the food that they eat and how the lake is tied to that food. Next. So does that work? The answer is yes, and I won't go into that other than to say this is public opinion poll. People have started to care about the lake more as we've started to message in this way. We've started to tell these kinds of stories. Next slide. All right, so what has the legislature then done? Go ahead, Thomas. This first slide just shows the pace of change. Nobody cared about the lake for a long time, so they didn't really do anything. In 2010, the legislature passed a bill, founded the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, but you have to fast forward for 7 years before the legislature ran a little tiny bill about the brine shrimp royalty. But then if you look at the pace of change, just go ahead and scroll through that, Thomas. You see pace of change. More and more laws being passed. Why?
Sorry.
Well, two things are happening at the same time. One is the lake is in crisis. It's going down. You've seen the publicity, right? You've seen the news stories. People are starting to care. The other thing is you had policy makers who had worked for a long time. They were in the right place at the right time to make some of these things happen. Every one of these bills, I was in the legislature to help get it through. My friend, Joel Ferry, a farmer, was also there, who cares about the lake, was also there to help get it through. So it's these two things happening at the same time really come together. Legislators stood up and said, let's do something. I want to illustrate just how long it takes for something to happen. Changing water law is hard. So it was 1983 that Utah, for the first time, recognized in a very limited way that the environment could have a right to water, but only a state agency could control it. I started working on a legislation maybe 20 years ago to say private people should be able to, under some conditions, allocate some of their water to the lake. By the time we got to 2020, so that's, you know, decades after the first bill, and almost, you know, 15 years after my first little baby bill like cracked open the door. Now the door is fully open. We passed a bill that fundamentally changed the ability to take water and dedicate it to Great Salt Lake. It took time, and it took a lot of effort. So what we're looking for when it comes to the lake, and you can imagine, if you were a group of farmers, and I'm a brine shrimper, and I come and I say, I want your water for brine shrimp, how are those farmers going to feel? They're going to say, sure, you can have the water. No, they're going to fight you for it, right? So we don't want to fight. We want to find solutions where the farmer wins, the lake wins, the brine shrimp wins. So if we take a farmer, I call him Farmer John. He's not a real farmer, but anyway, he's probably a model. Farmer John, if he grows alfalfa, that's a very popular crop in the state of Utah, the typical farmer gets 3 cuttings of alfalfa. The first cutting doesn't need any supplemental water. There's enough soil moisture from the winter that they get a good crop. The second crop, they have to start diverting water out of the rivers and streams that would otherwise go to Great Salt Lake. They divert it out. The last crop is often not as highly valuable, and they have to take tons of water out of the natural system, out of the rivers and streams, to get that crop to where they can market it. So what if I say to Farmer John, hey, I will give you the economic value of that third crop of alfalfa. You give me, animate it, the water, animate it again, crop 3 water, and I'm going to send it to Great Salt Lake. Ta-da! Farmers held harmless. Farmer is whole. The lake gets the water. What's needed? What do we need to make this work? Money. A lot of money. So I just want to talk about some of the things that have been done. I won't spend, I think we want to sort of fast forward, but each one of the bills that you see listed here was a significant piece of legislation, a once-in-a-generation type piece of legislation. We were fortunate to a lot of that, like I said, right place, right time, and some urgency because of the news and concern about the lake. We did a lot of legislative stuff. An example is passing a bill that says that the money that's made by the mineral companies who are evaporating water, we're going to take that money and we're going to prioritize it to protect the lake. So it's just an example. All right, Thomas. Thanks. So then what the state's done, we got the governor on board, and the governor's taken actions, and you can just click through those bullets fairly quickly. Close the basin to new appropriations, basically saying new people can't come and claim water rights anymore. Ordered the causeway breach closed. And then really just a lot of the state agencies have done a lot of things. We work with the state agencies, like Thomas said, and then they have responded by helping us out. Next one. And then also financial investments are really important. You know, in 2021, I was so excited. We got $1 million, $1 million US dollars to do some modeling, just to collect data, basically. In 2022, though, we got $365 million for water conservation, including almost $60 million for Great Salt Lake. And then we saw similar, even greater investments in 2023. And then we've seen some changes more recently to secure long-term funding for the lake. And I won't go into how we did that, but we've done that. Next. So Thomas mentioned this before, but it's important to realize it takes a village. And villages can be big and messy, and this is a big, messy village. Look at that slide, right? But when you get all of those people who represent different interests working together and talking together, it's amazing what you can do. And we'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow when we talk about policy responses, but you really have to try to find ways to bring everybody along. Okay, so I think we just have a summary slide and that's it. And maybe time for, I don't know, a question or two, but depending on how we're doing, Patrick. So, got to get everybody together. You need the technical and the policy solutions to work together. You can do so much more if you have both. Expect that it will take some time, but that's not an excuse to not do something, because you have to plant the fruit tree today if you want to harvest the fruit in 5 or 10 years from now. Because of these efforts, we're happy to report that the Great Salt Lake has proven a stable source of Artemia now for more than 30 years. And while the lake has flirted with crisis, it's in a pretty good place. We've tested some tools and we've been able to keep it in safe ranges, and that's because the state has really come along with us and the other stakeholders to work together. I think that's it.
I think it is.